Alright, greetings everybody and welcome to my continued series on themes of the 20th century. The last lecture I did would have been the one dealing with Nelson Mandela and South Africa. And what's interesting about India, and certainly when we look at Mahatma Gandhi, is the crossover, that there is that South African connection that we'll talk about as well. Many of the themes that I cover throughout my lecture series, and a recurring one, and I've probably mentioned this many times before, is the idea of leadership. That what is it that makes a good leader? How do leaders falter? How do leaders demonstrate good role modeling? How do leaders get things done? I mean, at the end of the day. And one of the wonderful things in history is we have the opportunity to look at and understand so many different personality types and so many intriguing characters as well. But when we're talking about Mahatma Gandhi, now I wanted to clarify, this confused me for quite some time. Mohandas was his name, and Mahatma was his title. So for the most part, when you read histories of Gandhi, you will see those terms used interchangeably. It's the same thing in the sense that Mohandas, it was his birth name, and Mahatma was the title that he would be granted because of his stature within Indian society. So he's more, I think he's known more as Mahatma Gandhi than he is Mohandas. What we know about Gandhi is that, and I think what makes him so appealing and so fascinating, is the tremendous amount of selflessness that he demonstrates in his actions and in his policies. And selflessness is a tough one, because you are sacrificing your own needs in life, in a sense, for the greater good. There are many examples of his selfless behavior. He would deny himself certain things, whether it be food, whether it be taking advantage of the adulation that he was getting through India, although he did struggle with that. He talked about the idea of succumbing to the opportunities that lay within a society that adores you. So he was always thinking about that thing, and he was always trying to deny himself things that gave him pleasure. And we're going to talk about what happens there in his early life. And when you demonstrate that kind of selflessness, commitment, and determination, inevitably and hopefully people will be drawn to those qualities. So Mahatma Gandhi is remarkable not just as an incredible leader, an inspirational leader, but also as a remarkable human being. And I think, I know it seems kind of obvious. You would think those two things are connected anyway, but there are a variety of leadership styles, and he was willing to sacrifice everything for the greater good. In fact, his family suffered because he was on the road all the time, constantly on the move, and we know that his family suffered, and they rebelled. His children rebelled, and there are all kinds of issues, but he would have to tell his family, I need to do this, I have to do this. In a way, for him, it became the people of India before his own family, although we do know that he was extremely close to his wife as well. So a lot of very interesting layers when we look at the personality of Gandhi. But let's go back, and I just want to sort of go back and talk about sort of the evolution of British colonialism and the events that lead up to sort of the entrance, if you will, of Mahatma Gandhi on the landscape of Indian politics. So let's look at here, of course, is a map of what is now current India. There goes, the border. You have Bangladesh up here, or no, Bangladesh is over here. See, even I need to learn my maps. Pakistan here, Nepal, and of course China would be up here. So Hinduism, of course, is the core religion. That means that in India, the majority of people are Hindu, but in certain areas, Islam, Sikhism, and Buddhism are more prevalent. So, for example, Buddhism would be popular more in the Nepal and the border regions closer to China. Sikhism is quite popular in the central northern part. And Islam probably more closer to this region because, of course, Pakistan would become its own nation, and the argument being that that's, they wanted to create a Muslim state. So, this is kind of hard for us to fathom living in Western cultures. The idea that there could be some 200 languages and dialects within India. Certainly when we use the American example, Spanish is very prevalent in certain parts of the country, and there's a variety of dialects, whether you're talking about someone from Seattle, Washington, or from, Birmingham, Alabama, a very different dialect. And in the case of Canada, you look at a British Columbia accent compared to a Cape Breton accent. Very, very different. But those are dialects. Dialects are when the language is the same, but the way of speaking it is different. But in India, there is such incredible diversity, 200 languages and dialects within one country. So it's quite remarkable. Historically, the predominant social structure or stratification of Indian society was built around the caste system, which basically defines people by birth, determines which occupations may be followed, who one may marry, and even the extent one may appear in public. So, it's not uncommon in South Asian families. Generally, we use the term South Asian when we talk about people from India. In the old days, we used to say Indian, but that was awfully confusing when we talked about First Peoples in Canada as Indians, but that's no longer the term we use either. We use First Nations for local Canadian First Peoples, and in the United States, we use Native Americans. So, South Asians have kind of dealt with this caste. It's been part of, so if you're born poor, you're going to stay poor. If you're born in a wealthy family, that's basically where you're going to stay, and there's very, very little to no social mobility between social classes in India. That, of course, has changed to some degree in the 20th century, particularly in the latter part in the early 21st century, where there is greater mobility for people who might be either very athletic and become a great athlete, or become an actor, or become a politician. I mean, it's a lot harder for people in the lower castes to kind of chisel their way up to the upper caste, but it does happen now with a greater degree of frequency. But the legacy of that caste system is still prevalent in South Asian society. Alright, so the English. Well, regular English contact in India began in the early 1600s with Elizabeth I, who granted a monopoly to the East India Company. This was quite common, and we saw this when we looked at the colonization of North America, that the Europeans would grant a company, who might petition them, say, look, I'm willing to explore new lands on behalf of the crown. Will you grant me a monopoly? Will you give me the right to travel on your behalf? And then we can share the spoils if we find anything. So the East India Company is given this monopoly to explore India. Now keep in mind that this was a heck of a journey in those days. This is before the Suez Canal, so if you wanted to go to India, unfortunately I don't have a map of the world, so try to visualize it or look at a map when you get a chance. You're talking traveling all the way down, around North Africa, past the Straits of Gibraltar, all the way down to the southern Cape, where South Africa is, and then across up to India that way. So that was a heck of a journey. That's why the Suez Canal became so important in the 1880s. When that was completed, it cut off travel time to India pretty much in half. India became an important refueling station. Initially, Britain looked at India as kind of a place to stop and rest and to continue their interest in what is now sort of Indonesia and South Asia. That is the Hong Kong region, that part of China. Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta became fortifications, so they're basically encampments where, as there's continued travel from England to the South Pacific, that route, India becomes a very important refueling station. And that would be the case, of course, in South Africa as well, would be a part of this, their lines of communication. And the thing is, during the height of British imperialism and British colonialism, you need those refueling stations everywhere. If you're going to, I mean, if the sun doesn't set on the British Empire, you're going to have lots of places to stop, refuel, get clean water, food, and then continue on your journey. Britain withdrew from Indonesian islands as a result of fierce competition from the Dutch, and of course the Dutch would later play a big role in the development of Indonesia. The French and the Portuguese interests there. The East India Company was forced to create a private army to defend interests, and during the 18th century, colonial wars with France, all non-British interests would be ousted from India. What's interesting is that when you look at the Battle of Plassey, which is sort of the key battle where the French make their final stand, if you will, on South Asian soil, 1757, right at that time, you know, at the exact same time for that matter, Britain and France were fighting it over in the wilderness of the Ohio River Valley and much through Quebec, what is now Quebec and southern Ontario. So, I mean, you know, it can't be understated how global this colonial competition was for both the French and the British. Okay, so after the Battle of Plassey of 1757, from that point forward, Great Britain basically is the primary colonial power in India. And, you know, for Great Britain, this was an incredibly fruitful colony, rather, the crown jewel of the empire, they would call it. And, you know, at the end of the day, when you're trying to make sense of colonialism is difficult to do in our modern sensibility. But, I mean, in those days, it was all about power, it was all about control, it was about the exploitation of labor, the exploitation of resources. I mean, the propaganda that British subjects were fed in order to understand and rationalize colonialism was sort of this, for lack of a better term, to use Rudyard Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden. Okay, it is the moral responsibility, and I'm going to use Great Britain as an example, but it should be noted that other imperial powers, whether it be Portugal, France, Spain, and others, use the same kind of messaging. It is the moral obligation of the civilized world, in this case the mighty British Empire, to civilize all four corners of the globe. That, in fact, what we're doing is we're traveling overseas and we're bringing civilization, we're bringing the English language, we're bringing the Anglican Church, we're bringing everything British, because the more they're like us, the better off they will be, right? We are civilizing four corners of the world. And so that's why during the height of the imperial period, particularly during the late Victorian period, there was such tremendous pride. I mean, Winston Churchill grew up right during that time, when at the height of the British Empire, and, you know, right to his dying day, you know, he was absolutely devoted to the idea of the role modeling of the British Empire. And so that's basically, you know, what's happening. And, you know, at the end of the day, how is it that these European nations can go overseas and control these nations? You know, I hate to sound crass, but at the end of the day, it's gunpowder. You know, it's the ability to intimidate these peoples. It had nothing to do with race. You know, racism is sort of born out of this imperial age when you start using Darwinist ideas and incorporate social Darwinist language, which lead to racism and pitting races against another. Nazism is born out of social Darwinism as well. It gets really ugly. But for the British, you know, they have now a strong hold on India. And by 1857, Britain's been in charge for 100 years. But there begins to be cracks in the system, if you will. The Mutiny of 1857 was a real strong message to India. And basically what it does, why it happens, by the way, is rather results in English ignorance to religious sensitivity. So not fully understanding Hindu religion, not fully understanding cultural sensitivities and so on and so forth. You know, the arrogance of colonial powers was that to have pretty much, for the most part, disregard for indigenous culture and religious systems and so forth, and spirituality. It's a real tragedy. I mean, there were those who were fascinated with foreign cultures and foreign religions and spirituality, but it's amazing to what extent there was this arrogance to suggest that, well, what you guys worship and what you guys do for cultural practices is archaic and savage, and we, the great European colonial occupiers, are going to provide you the best thing you could possibly have. So Indian soldiers were issued new cartridges in 1757 for rifles greased with either beef fat, sacred to Hindus, or pork fat, prohibited by Islam. One of the other ugly things of colonialism is the idea that you have indigenous peoples working for and hired by the British Army. They're called sepoys in India. And when there are rebellions or clashes, you as an Indian soldier for the British Army, a sepoy, have to go out and raise your rifles against essentially your own people. So I can't imagine the impossible situation for these people, but what happens here is when they're issued these guns, they say, whoa, 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 wait a second, no way, we can't, this is completely wrong. Basically, the British administration said, if you guys don't do what you're told, you're going to be arrested, and then what happens is those Indian soldiers in the British Army begin to rebel, and they begin to mutiny. They say, I refuse now to fight on behalf of the British Empire. Mutineers committed atrocities against the British nationals, and at Lucknow, 3,000 troops and civilian families endure a 5-month siege. Why was the mutiny so violent? Well, I think it's pretty clear that after 100 years of British colonialism, there was a growing resentment. And what happens in these situations is that all this suppressed frustration and anger just requires, a trigger point, and then it explodes. So it's not like it just happens all at once. Those sentiments and feelings are already underneath the periphery, and it just takes an event to allow them to kind of lash out. So it gets pretty ugly. The British reprisals were vicious, and the mutiny created an even greater era of repression. Now, of course, these sepoys were going into English communities and killing people and rounding people up. But when this thing was over, the British were equally as brutal, and they used to role model discipline in the people, particularly the former sepoys, the soldiers. They would be brought into open areas where a key leader of a mutiny would be tied by his back against a cannon. And of course, a match would be struck, or whatever it was they used, and the fuse would be lit, and you can imagine the outcome. You want to instill terror, well, you blow someone apart from a cannon. So, the reprisals were brutal, and unfortunately what ends up happening, like any rebellion, we've seen this over and over and over in history, that if you are not successful in overtaking the powers you're trying to take over, they are going to deal you a heavy blow as a result. So rebellions generally refer to events that are not successful, where revolutions are, right? And that's kind of the difference between a rebellion and a revolution. Well, Queen Victoria, for her part, had an authentic fascination and love for India. One of her main servants was South Asian, and she developed a very warm relationship with him, and learned a lot about Indian culture and customs and food, as well. So there was, as a result, I think, of this relationship and of her interest in India, there was a general warmth between the Queen and India. In 1858, a year after the mutiny, a royal proclamation is enacted. Personal respect for India and interest in their advancement was central to the document. Now, yes, these are only words on paper, And that's what the most vocal critics of the Royal Proclamation were saying in India. Yeah, right, they're just words on paper. But it is a move and step in the right direction. It's looking at India with a greater degree of respect and an understanding that we have to move forward in our relationship. Indians became subjects of the British Empire, right? And, unfortunately what this means for Indians, or South Asians rather, is that, when war breaks out in 1914, they're going to go fight for the Empire as British subjects. So, British saw it as a policy to develop India further, but Indians saw it as a first step to self-government. So the interpretation of what the Royal Proclamation meant from the perspective of the Indians or South Asians and the perspective of the British were kind of two different things. 1877, Victoria would become then Empress of India, right? So, and this is once again a reflection of her compassion for and interest in India. In Victoria, British Columbia, the colony was called Victoria after Queen Victoria, and the main hotel in Victoria is the Empress. So you can see that British connection in Victoria, BC. All right, World War I. British promises of Arab independence after the defeat of the Ottomans made Indians wonder why they were exempt. Hundreds of thousands of colonial troops fought in the horror show of the trenches of Europe. And they're thinking, why are you talking national self-determination for those people, but not for us? I mean, Mahatma Gandhi went to the Paris Peace Conferences. A lot of colonials did, colonial leaders. Ho Chi Minh attended the Paris Peace Conference, seeking independence of Indochina, later to become Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. So a lot of Indians are thinking, why are we exempt? We did our duty. Should we be granted some autonomy? India would be granted representatives at the Imperial War Conference of 1917. In fact, so would Canada. So, both Wilson's 14 points and the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia would provide inspiration for Indians. For the pressure, for the British, it means more pressure. So out of the ashes of World War I, developed two remarkable role models and examples: the Russian Revolution, Bolshevism, communism, Marxism, whatever term you want to use, and Wilson's 14 points. A cornerstone of that idea was national self-determination for all peoples. People like Gandhi and even Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was a great lover of the United States. He initially was not interested, he was curious about Bolshevism, but his man was Woodrow Wilson. So it's interesting that, in India, these ideas, democracy, national self-determination, and on the other side, Bolshevism, were beginning to kind of become popular. Britain felt more insecure in India, which led to a greater assertion of control. This is classic. How many times in history have we seen this? When a nation feels insecure about their national security, for whatever reason, the best solution is to clamp down. But by clamping down, you lay the seeds of discontent. I think so much of the Tsar's government before the 1917 revolution in Russia. And if you're interested, have a look at my lecture on the Russian Revolution, where I talk quite a bit about that. The idea that, oh my gosh, these people are rebelling, we better suppress it and bring in the troops and gun them down. And well, what do you think is going to happen as a result of that? Nobody's thinking, well, maybe if we compromise, maybe if we actually invite them to see what they're upset about, we can reach some sort of consensus or something. But no, you bring in the guns, you suppress, you're fueling the flames of discontent. Well, and I would argue that Amritsar is the culmination of the bubbling tensions that were growing in India after World War I. And Amritsar is the great example of the length to which a colonial power is willing to go to in order to maintain control. And it's an ugly example of repression. So, Amritsar is a holy city for Sikhs at the center of the Punjab, which is like a province or a state, as you would say in the United States. General Dyer, the British general in command of this region, would ban all public meetings in Amritsar, but a public meeting was called. Now, I need to mention too, that in Amritsar at this time there was an annual harvest festival, which is part of their roots, their tradition, part of their culture. And Dyer kind of bans this meeting on the eve of this annual harvest festival, which was really pretty brutal if you think about it, because the people that were going out into the city were going to celebrate the crops and renewal and all that kind of stuff. So the town center was an open space enclosed on all sides by backs of buildings. Okay, let me just explain. It's almost kind of like Tiananmen Square, but right in the center of Amritsar is where the people would congregate. I guess that's where they would celebrate and set up their tables and show off the fruits of their labor and so forth. It was like almost like a kind of circular area that had I think 2 entrance and exit points. And once you came in through these entrance and exit points, you were inside this open area. Okay? So what happens is all these people are congregating into this region, and the British, General Dyer, sends in the troops through both entrances. So if the British troops are standing at the entrance of this open area in Amritsar, there's nowhere to go, right? You can't run away. Up to 20,000 Punjabis were in the square. I guess it is a square. I said a circle. Okay, a square. When Dyer arrived with Indian troops, who fired all 1,600 rounds of ammunition. The only reason General Dyer stopped firing was because the troops ran out of bullets. Think about this. A harvest festival of people celebrating their crops. Also, I think there was also resistance to the controls implemented, the ban that Dyer put in. But to go in there and machine gun these people down, people were running all over the place. Nobody could go anywhere because both entrances or all entrances were closed off. There was a well in the middle of Amritsar that people were diving into. And when at the end of all this, when they recovered the bodies, there was literally stacks of bodies in the well, people trying to escape the gunfire. And if you didn't die from gunfire, you were crushed to death if you were one of the first to go down. So 379 people were killed in minutes and 1,200 were seriously injured. What the other horrible piece is that when the British Army left, many of the soldiers who did the shooting were sepoys. They were devastated. Their first reaction was to go out and help these people, but Dyer gave strict order that everybody was to leave the square and leave these people to suffer in agony by themselves. So they were forbidden from helping these people. So Dyer declared martial law, and floggings of suspects were rampant, so the repression continued after the massacre itself. Internationally and domestically, it brought great attention to India. I guess if there's anything that could be deemed as positive about this horrible experience, was that everybody around the world, particularly within the British Empire, were reading about this event in India. So it caught the front pages of all the major newspapers. In fact, Winston Churchill at the time said that this is the beginning of the end. He was furious at the Amritsar situation because, he was a devoted imperialist, and he understood that this was going to create conditions where would begin a very diligent process of not only revenge against the British Empire, but a strong desire to be free of British colonialism. The drive for self-determination became very strong, and Gandhi would become front and center of independence. Now, by 1919, he'd been actively involved in civil disobedience for over 20 years. Remember, he goes to South Africa during the Zulu Wars. In fact, during the Boer War, he ends up in South Africa. We're going to talk about that shortly. So there he is, Mahatma, as a young man. Here he is, probably mid-20s. Born in 1869, the youngest of 6 in the Gujarat region of India. He was married at 13, and he would travel to London in 1888 to study law. Okay, lots of really interesting things to talk about here. Married at 13, I mean, I think about my kids, who are, two of which are older than 13, but I can't imagine my children being married. It's just a nightmare to even imagine. But here he was, he's married, arranged marriage, of course, as always. And there was one very, very key incident, and there are moments in Gandhi's life, I think, that end up shaping who he would later become. The first one was not long after his marriage. His father had fallen quite ill and was quite sick in bed, and he was sitting by his father's side day in and all night as well. And at one moment that his father is resting, he leaves the bedside of his father to be with his wife. And then when he and his wife had spent time together, he comes back and his father had died. And he felt such profound sorrow for it. The moment that he felt the moment that his father needed him most, he was seeking pleasure, if you will, with his wife. And that's the association that he begins to develop of denying him things that make him feel good, whether it be certain food, alcohol, sex, you name it, right? So he really has an epiphany with this moment, and he's committed after this point to right the wrongs of leaving his father at his deathbed, because he was leaving his father at a time where he felt he was being selfish, right? Well, nothing selfish about wanting to be with your wife, but the point being is that, that really, really stuck with him, and really dictates his later behavior. I mean, he does make a decision at one point to declare celibacy, and the day he told his wife, honey, I'm celibate, and she's thinking, well, do I not have a say in this? But once again, his celibacy, or commitment to it, was drawn from this notion of denying himself things, paying back what he felt he had done wrong, or paying penance, or something to that effect. So you kind of get the point here. But so he studies law. He goes to London. You got to think, when he goes to London in 1888, he is 19 years old. And when he gets to Victorian London in 1888, he is overwhelmed with the architecture, the bustling nature, the everything, the hotels, chandeliers, you name it, everything he was fascinated with. The first thing he does is he goes and buys himself a three-piece suit with a cane and a top hat. When he gets to London rather, his prime ambition, according to himself in his writings, was to be an English gentleman. And there's so many great stories of his early time in London, where there's one time when he first arrives and he goes to a hotel to stay the night, he's just overwhelmed in the lobby at the adornments and the chandeliers and the chairs and the Victorian clothing that people were wearing. And he looks over to the right and he sees this cute square little room, and he goes, well, that's an interesting little room. And he walks over and he walks inside the room. And all of a sudden these doors shut and he's trapped inside this room, and then the room begins to move. And he begins to scream in terror. And I guess when he gets to the second floor and the doors open, the people that are waiting for the elevator see this poor little fellow, this little Indian South Asian man in a top hat and a three-piece suit, shuddering in absolute fear and not realizing that he was in an elevator. He didn't know what an elevator was. So, just interesting stuff how that happens. So he goes to London. He definitely develops a good command of the English language. He comes back to India and he's now going to practice law. Well, Gandhi was a very, very shy human being. I mean, he has to work very hard to overcome that as he gets older. But in his first court case, after all these years of studying, he's unable to speak. He's in the courtroom and the judge is going, Mr. Gandhi, could you please proceed? And he just couldn't budge. His words, that is. And he left the courtroom in disgrace and he was overwhelmed with humiliation as a result of this. So when he realizes that law in a conventional sense, in a courtroom as a lawyer, may not be his calling, he decides to go to South Africa. Now this is about, I'd have to look, but I'm pretty sure it's like very late 1890s. It's right around that Boer War period. And he goes there to be an advocate and representative for Indian workers who have gone to South Africa to work, who are being brutally discriminated against in South Africa. Remember, South Africa, the extreme nature of racism was even considerably harsher in India. India was more muted, you know. It was there, but it wasn't brutal in the same way as it was in South Africa. You know, and what's interesting is, you know, here's Gandhi, well-educated, well-dressed, ready to go. He buys a first-class ticket in India, and when he gets to South Africa, you know, he gets on the train. I think he lands in Johannesburg. He gets on the train to travel to his next destination, and the ticket man comes up to him and says, you know, what are you doing here? And he says, oh, I'm taking a train to wherever it was he was going. Get off. You're not supposed to be here. And he says, but I have a ticket. Well, let's see your ticket. So he shows him the ticket, and indeed it's a first-class ticket. And the train conductor says, well, I don't care if you've got you're not allowed, it's supposed to be here. Get off. And he kind of refuses, says, wait a second here. He never experienced, see, Gandhi had never experienced this kind of overt racism before. Not like this. And so he resists, says, no, I bought a ticket. He ends up being picked up and thrown off this train. Literally, they stopped the train to throw him off. And it wasn't difficult. Gandhi was only 4'11". He was a little guy, you know. That moment is pivotal because he was absolutely mortified by what he'd experienced. But out of that mortification comes this sense of, I am here to defend my people and workers, and now more than ever, he was going to defend them at all costs. So, very, very important moment. Upon his return to India in 1915, after some 15 or so years there, he had already become very well known for his work in South Africa. Basically, what he does is he develops, because he knew that the state, in South Africa in particular, was more than willing to bring in the guns and exhibit and demonstrate tremendous violence towards the Indian population, that he begins to develop in South Africa his sort of non-violent disobedience. Like, we have to have ways of protesting, whether it be not buying certain products, whether it be not adhering to certain laws, but never, ever did he want his supporters to raise a fist. And we'll talk about how he really develops this even further when he comes back to India. So when he returns in 1915, the legend of Gandhi had already begun to kind of develop in circles within India. So when he comes back, he's in a position to begin the process of defending the interests of Indian subjects in India. All right. So, you know, there's there's a lot of really remarkable history here, and I'll admit I've got sort of a general understanding of the religious qualities of Hinduism and Sikhism and so forth, but it's pretty marginal at best. I would like to learn more, but a lot of what he begins to develop in terms of his nonviolent disobedient campaigns and his philosophy behind it are built around this notion of kind of making amends with his own past, if you will, or demonstrating selflessness. His campaigns mobilized people into action. Many followed the Congress Party. You know, you have to consider that Gandhi was not a political man, he was a spiritual leader, right? He didn't see himself as the leader of a political party. He saw himself as a leader of the people of India, whether you were Sikh, whether you were Hindu, whether you were Muslim. It didn't matter. Methods were a powerful combination of spiritual strength, and that comes to his sense of denying him things, political skill and sheer theatricality. Okay, when the cameras are rolling and the press is there, he knows how to play a room, right? So he will forever be associated with nonviolent civil disobedience. Later, some 20 years after or 10 years after the death of Gandhi, would emerge Martin Luther King in the United States, and his number one inspiration was Gandhi and his policy of nonviolent civil disobedience. Gandhi believed the British could be shamed into leaving India. Okay, interesting. So what ends up happening is he begins to mobilize people to resist certain policies, and whether it be, you know, taxes on British products, or Indians not allowed to take salt from the sea, or whatever. He says, we're going to do it in a way that we're going to demonstrate the ugliness. We are going to make them feel so bad about what they're doing that they're simply going to leave. You know, take the blow. They may beat us, but we are not going to hit back. That's a pretty tough thing to do when somebody's hitting you over the head with a billy club and you're bleeding and your head's throbbing, your bones are aching, and you're falling to the ground, and you're not going to rise up against it. Eventually, those people will feel profound guilt. What's remarkable is the ability of Gandhi to get people behind this idea. And I want to share one quick story. There's a lot of stories I have where Gandhi's concerned, because I've read quite a bit. I've always been very fascinated with him. There was one march that they were doing, he and his followers. There were a couple hundred of them. Can't remember where they were going, but they were protesting something, whether it be a tax or something. And they were confronted by members of the British Army, although the cavalry, that is horseback, men on horseback. And as the Gandhi's constituents were moving up this dusty road, they could see down the road a lineup of British soldiers with guns, their helmets on horses. And Gandhi says, okay, everybody stop. And his close associates say, Gandhi, we got to get out of here. They've got horses. They're going to trample us and they're going to shoot us. Can we go? He says, no, do not move. He turns around, everyone behind him. Under no circumstances do I want any of you to move. And they're nervous. They're sweating. They're terrified. And all of a sudden, they see down the road that the order is given to charge. Here comes the cavalry. Boom, 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 heading towards them. People are going, we got to get out of here. And Gandhi says, everybody lie on your bellies. Everybody lie on your bellies. Everyone gets down on the ground and lies on their bellies, right? And when the cavalry arrives, what Gandhi knew that maybe his other friends didn't know was that horses will not trample on people on the ground. So what happens is when the cavalry arrives to the people who are now all on their stomachs, the horses rear up and throw off all the British soldiers and cause total disarray. And the soldiers are running in different directions. British soldiers are getting broken arms. They're falling, bonking their heads. And when all the horses flee and all the soldiers get up all scattered and confused and begin to walk away, Gandhi says, okay, everybody get up. To me, that is remarkable for a couple of reasons. Number one, the fact that Gandhi knew that horses wouldn't trample on humans lying on the ground. But secondly, to have that kind of commitment and devotion from your followers, I mean, I don't know what I would have done in that circumstance. Would I have lied on the ground or run sideways the heck out of there? It's hard not to feel like you wouldn't flee for your life, but that to me is just an example of his tremendous commitment to his cause, or that his followers had towards him, that they were willing to, I'm not going to say blindly follow him, but they were willing to basically support him in whatever twist and turn of policy and platform he was going to take. So this, by the way, what ends up happening, why we have this association with Gandhi and like a loincloth, and that's it, is part of the resistance to having to buy British-made clothes that were heavily taxed. See, what becomes hallmark of Gandhi's campaign is self-reliance. We have been brought up and trained to be, we've learned to be completely helpless. We've had to buy British-made goods, we've had to pay British taxes. What happens if we make our own clothing and we get rid of everything that's British? You know, that was one of his big hallmark of his protest. in order to demonstrate, in order to get the British out of here, we need to demonstrate to them that we can take care of ourselves. And part of that is going to be by making our own clothing. So he would spin his own clothing. I don't know, he spent a certain amount of time every day, an hour and a half or whatever it was, spinning, right? Making his own clothing, leading by example. So, Satyagraha was the name of this philosophy, an emotional and spiritual commitment to the struggle for truth and overall justice. So non-cooperation includes boycotts of law courts by lawyers, schools by teachers, and also of British cloth and industry. Frequently imprisoned by British authorities, it turned him into a martyr, because what would happen was he would be imprisoned and then he would refuse to eat, and they would have to release him, right, because he was going to die in prison from starvation. I mean, that's the kind of power he had, the ability to deny himself food as a political protest, not shooting somebody or demanding that his followers attack an army barracks. No, it's doing harm to himself. That's my protest. So he would work closely with Nehru, who was the leader of the Congress Party, CP, and was, you know, Nehru was a great admirer of Gandhi, and even though Gandhi was not trying to avoid the trappings of getting involved in politics, the Congress Party was probably closest in synchronicity with Gandhi's eventual goals of national self-determination, if you will. Resistance to purchasing British-made products and encouraging Indians to make their own to avoid taxation would lead to the famous Salt March of 1930. You know, and actually just before the Salt March, actually I don't know if it was just before or just after, maybe it was just after, he actually went to England and met with the leadership and met the king. And actually when he went to India, he went in his loincloth and his cane, and people were just like, oh my gosh, you can't come to Britain and dress like this. And he insisted that I'm not going to come with a top hat and a cane. That's the old Gandhi. This is the new Gandhi. And when people asked the King of England, you know, how do you feel about, are you offended that he's just walking around here in a loincloth? And he said, oh, I don't mind at all. I think he's wearing enough for both of us, I think is what the king said at the time. So I'd have to look to see if it was just before or just after, but he was invited to London. And that's, I think, 1930, after the Salt March, where the British really began to understand that holding on to this nation as a colony would inevitably have to change. With 78 chosen supporters, Gandhi marched 400 kilometers from Sabarmati, to the sea at Dandi Beach. There they would collect muddy salt and boil it in order to make it pure and usable. So basically what he was doing is, we are fully capable of getting our own salt. I'm going to march down to Dandi Beach, and of course he starts with 78 followers, but when word gets out that he's doing this, hundreds of thousands of people flock, and by the time they get to Dandi Beach, there's thousands of people with him. And he reaches down, puts his hand in the muddy, he says, with this hand I will create salt, you know, and because they had to buy, as I said before, British-made salt that was taxed. So here's the point: learning to be self-sufficient. It was an attempt to publicize a boycott of the salt tax by the British. Became a publicity coup and took on the character of a pilgrimage. 20,000 would be arrested, and Gandhi would be imprisoned in Bombay again. You know, when he would be in prison, he was in prison so frequently that a lot of the prison guards would be like, oh, Gandhi, not you again. You know, and they actually loved him. People just adored him. He was just such a kind, gentle man. And, you know, they'd be like so worried when he'd be in prison, because, of course, every time he went into prison, he would suddenly deny himself food. And, you know, the cycle would continue like that. So then World War II breaks out, right? And that kind of delays things a bit for Indian independence. Despite resistance to the empire, 2 million Indians, South Asians, would join the armed forces. Churchill, who once remarked that India was totally unsuited for democracy, appeared oblivious to the contradiction of fighting for liberty and democracy, and while attempting to thwart it for India. There's a little bit of irony in that, isn't there? As Japan made headway in Malaya and Burma, British nationals in India felt great pressure to make promises of democracy, but resisted with force. So here they are, the British Army having to suppress rebellion in India when those troops should have been on the front line fighting the Japanese and the Nazis. The Quit India campaigns were put down with 57 infantry divisions within India, right? Quit India campaigns. The British were losing their moral authority. Was preserving the empire more important than defeating fascist enemies abroad? Those were the kinds of questions that people were asking. Okay. Well, the victory of the Labour leader Attlee after the war ensured independence for India because, of course, that was one of his key platforms. Mountbatten would be the last viceroy to India. Now, I should tell you, there's another great story. One thing I haven't mentioned about Gandhi is the fact that he had a tremendous sense of humor, and he had almost sort of this prankish side to him. There's one incident where he had a scheduled meeting with Lord Mountbatten, right? Yeah, the last viceroy. And I guess when he gets to Mountbatten's home, knocks on the door, and Mountbatten's daughter answers the door. And she says, "Oh, Gandhi, come on in." And she says, "He'll be just a minute. Can I get you anything?" He says, "Yes, I'd like a warm glass of water with a spoon." Okay, good. So she goes in, she gets a warm glass of water with a spoon, brings it in. And what he does is he takes a chunk of salt out of his loincloth, he plops it into the water, stirs it with a spoon, and drinks it down. And he leans over to Mountbatten's daughter and says, "Now, don't tell your father. This is the salt I made at Dandy Beach during the Salt March. He can't know that." And he smirked at her, and she just smirked back at him. And, that's kind of his way, right? He was charming, bright, good sense of humor. And Mountbatten, he adored him, and there was one time also where he came to visit, but it was on a day where he was having, I guess there were certain days where he wasn't supposed to speak, a day of silence it was called. And then one time he met Mountbatten, and Mountbatten asked a question, he went like this. And Mountbatten goes, "Not another day of silence," so this kind of thing. As Independence Day approached, violence increased between Muslims and Hindus. The goal for Mahatma Gandhi was to have a singular, unified India that was the umbrella of all ethnic, cultural, and religious groups within. But the Muslims really, really wanted their own thing. And he tried everything he could. And as it got closer to Independence Day, the violence began to bubble. At midnight on August 15th, the two nations of India and Pakistan came into existence. Right, here you've got India and then Pakistan. So Pakistan was part of the colonial India, but became an independent Muslim nation after. Massacres resulting in 1 million deaths resulted in the migrations of Sikhs, Muslims, and Hindus. Here's the problem. You've created a Muslim India, and the Muslims that were living in current India and the Hindus that were in the new Pakistan felt like they had to leave. And, these are people that had lived in these territories for generations. So they're bitter and angry that they feel inclined to have to leave. And as they cross each other's paths, as they're migrating to these new nations, they're slaughtering each other. And it's just unbelievable. And of course, Gandhi is thinking, "I told you so." And Gandhi was devastated that he went into when you stop eating, I can't remember the term, what that is, but he basically refused to eat, and he came very close to dying in one of these fasts. But Gandhi had to come to terms with the fact that Pakistan and India were going to be two nations. Kashmir has also been a focus of conflict between Muslims and Hindus. What's interesting is there was like a plebiscite, I believe, in Kashmir, and even though it was a high population of Muslims, maybe even a majority, that population at that time voted to be part of India as opposed to part of Pakistan. and Kashmir's in the far north, and you know, there have been wars fought over Kashmir between Pakistan and India for generations, and there's always mounting tensions in that region. January 30th, 1948, Gandhi was assassinated by a Hindu fundamentalist who thought Gandhi was too sympathetic to non-Hindus, is the word that's supposed to be there, to non-Hindus. What a tragedy. Here he is, his incredible life. He saw through with great difficulty the independence of India, the creation of a new Pakistan, the removal of the British colonial structure, and he's assassinated by a fellow Hindu who said he's being too soft on non-Hindus, that he had somehow betrayed the Hindu religious order because of his compromise with other religions. So the emotional letting out, all that infighting that was occurring between all these religious groups, you know, stopped stone cold on the day that he died. You know, it's amazing, and it was at that point, I think, where people who weren't even Hindu realized that a truly remarkable being has left the mortal world, if you will. I would strongly suggest, if you're interested in this topic, you know, you can't go wrong with the 1982 film Gandhi, which is directed by, is it David Attenborough? I always get Richard Attenborough and David Attenborough confused. Won Best Picture of 1982. As I said, Ben Kingsley plays Gandhi. It is a remarkable piece of film. I believe it's 3 hours and some. But if you've just watched this and you're intrigued with this subject and intrigued with Gandhi, I would really suggest that you watch that film. Keep in mind that for any of these lectures that I do, we have a wonderful resource in YouTube where you can basically go into YouTube and put in, you know, history of India, and you'll find all kinds of stuff. Some of it not so good, some of it haphazardly put together, but every now and again you'll find a really good quality made production of a historical series. So please do use YouTube to your benefit when you get the chance. That being said, I want to thank you very much for watching this lecture, and I look forward to your comments or questions if you have any, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.